Good afternoon, Chicago. I'm Sasha Ann Simons, and this is Reset. Coming up this hour, it is the first day of school for hundreds of thousands of Chicago students. We'll check in on what folks should keep an eye on this year. But first, the Democratic National Convention put Chicago in the spotlight. And we've been hearing a lot of opinions about our city from out-of-towners. Some people who visited said they loved the great weather. Some mentioned they were surprised at how beautiful Chicago was. And that's in part because of the reputation of Chicago as a dangerous city. Take Donald Trump's running mate J.D. Vance, for instance, when he called Chicago the murder capital of the U.S.
It's almost a joke to me that they held it in Chicago, which has become the murder capital of the United States of America. My little theory about why they decided to have the convention in Chicago is, Tim Walz has been going around saying that he served in war, and maybe they did it in Chicago so that he could actually accurately say that he visited a combat zone.
Chicago being called a combat zone is not new, and Chicagoans don't deny that gun violence is a very real issue that we face here. But exaggerations like these can be dehumanizing, and they often ignore the efforts that local people are doing to try to solve the issue and the people most directly affected. So later on the show, we're going to be talking with some people who are working to solve the problem. But first, to separate fact from fiction and discuss the impact of these narratives, we're joined by Rita Oceguera, a reporter for The Trace. That's a nonprofit newsroom dedicated to shining a light on gun violence. Hi, Rita.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Also with us is Kim Smith, who's Director of Programs for the University of Chicago's Crime Lab. That's a nonpartisan behavioral and social science research lab. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And Lakaya Knight is also on the line with us. She's a youth leader for Communities United, which is a survivor-led racial justice organization. Hi, Lakaya.
Hi, thank you.
Rita, I'll start with you. Tell us what you think of this framing of Chicago as the country's quote-unquote crime capital and where you think it comes from.
Yeah, it's something that Chicago has had to deal with for a long time, all the time. And the people I've talked to, I'm often talking to survivors or people who have been impacted by gun violence, and they're really just tired of it. They understand where it comes from because they do face gun violence, and that's a reality of what's happening in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't like the nuance around the conversation. It's not just gun violence happening in the city; it's the resources that are missing that these communities need, that they're asking or that they've been asking for years, and that a lot of times they're still not getting. So they like to focus that narrative more on that rather than the numbers, because like you said earlier, it's dehumanizing when you're just focusing on those numbers and not realizing the impact it has on people.
Yeah, ahead of the DNC, you actually talked with a dozen residents to try to learn what they wanted leaders coming to town to know about gun violence in Chicago. What are some of the things you heard?
First of all, they wanted them to come and meet them. They didn't want them to just stay at the United Center and just, celebrate and have that DNC party. And that's great, sure. But they wanted to come and visit them and hear from them the resources that are needed, the youth programs that are needed, the mental health facilities that are needed. They really wanted to see the everlasting impact that gun violence has. It doesn't just happen and it happens and it's gone, right? It lasts with them forever, and they need resources after something happens too.
Yeah. Kim, I want to bring you in here because, there are, as Rita pointed out too, some misconceptions. And I want you to sort of help us understand what the data actually say about Chicago, because I want to be clear. Some folks listening to us will be thinking that we might be splitting hairs a little bit, right? Splitting, stats and talking about total number of homicides versus murder rate. Some people don't quite see the difference there. So I want you to help break down some of those numbers and where Chicago ranks and how that the narrative that we've been seeing across the nation could end up being more dangerous than what's actually happening.
No, it's really important to be precise when we're talking about this, mostly because, we're talking about people's lives, families who are impacted, and the kind of conversation about data and statistics. These are people. So we need to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page. And when we talk about Chicago, because we are such a big city population-wise, we do often have the kind of biggest number of gun violence victims when you look at kind of end of year homicide and murder data. But when you account for the size of our population and look at the rate, we're more in the middle of the pack. Cities like Baltimore, St. Louis often have higher rates. And that might sound, that might be, not super reassuring. And I think it is really important to kind of keep both of those things in mind. Even in Chicago, depending on where you live in the city, your experience with safety looks very different, not just by neighborhood, but by race, because we are such a segregated city. We look at the data broken out by, homicides experienced by Black Chicagoans, white Chicagoans, Latinx Chicagoans, and it's a very different story. So the kind of increase that we had in 2020 disproportionately impacted, in the same way that the COVID-19 pandemic did, communities of color, specifically Black Chicagoans. But the progress that we've made in the last few years has also disproportionately benefited some of the most vulnerable in our city. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we talk about investments and disparities, even within our city.
Right.
It's really a tale of three cities.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that safety gap there, and the fact that gun violence does disproportionately affect Black and brown Chicagoans. We know that 1/3 of Chicago's population is Black, but last year more than 75% of homicide victims were Black. This is according to end-of-year analysis from the UChicago Crime Lab. What else can you say about that?
Well, I think the other thing to focus on is just how spatially concentrated gun violence is, but that presents an opportunity. So we looked at data over the summer to try to figure out, how can we be proactive and deploy resources to the areas most likely to experience a shooting or a homicide. And what we saw was a tiny share of blocks in the city of Chicago, about 5%, accounted for over 1/3 of all shootings and homicides. So that is information that, we shouldn't just look at it and kind of do a data exercise. We should bring together the business community, government, philanthropy, and really focus on those tiny share of blocks for investments and programs that we know can have an impact. So I think the data can highlight the kind of challenges that we're facing, but also hopefully be instructive as we think about solutions.
Lakaya, what would you say to the people who characterize and define Chicago by gun violence?
What would I say to those people?
I'm sure you have those conversations or hear those conversations quite often, right? Of people who don't live here or just sort of looking at this city from across the country and defining the city as though that's all there is to it.
I would say that don't judge a book by its cover. I mean, we all go through gun violence. Doesn't just happen in Chicago. Gun violence happen, anywhere, and it kind of comes off as inhumane and insensitive because it's like gun violence happens everywhere, and just to only put down Chicago like we created, like it just started out of nothing. Like, no, all in all, it's kind of sad, and it really makes me mad. It really makes me frustrated, and I can't even express that frustration without I'm feeling like somebody's going to threaten me for my life. So it's just one of those things where it really puts me in a place of like solidarity. It really makes me not want to express how I feel on gun violence or even on a topic because you get a lot of backlash. You get a lot of people that do not care.
Yeah.
You get a lot of people.
What did you mean by someone is threatening your life? You said, was that a feeling?
It could be both. It could be a feeling or it can be somebody actually verbally saying how they feel, like to you on the topic. Like speaking on gun violence, everybody deals with gun violence differently. People expresses their emotions differently and their behavior differently. So I just feel like gun violence, it really, really, really triggers violence. It triggers rage. It triggers a lot.
I see.
So a lot of people do not understand, like living in Chicago, you know that gun violence, it really it really pulls, like it really pulls and it tugs at everything in your life. But for people outside of the city or just people in the city that I could have just lost somebody, and to hear what they are saying is
It can be
insensitive.
triggering.
Not taking it. Yeah, it's triggering and it's very offensive. So I may say something and they may get mad because they don't see it like that.
Yeah.
You know?
And this, I want to make sure our listeners understand, Lakaya, this is personal. This issue is very personal for you. Tell us what happened to your father.
So, I remember my dad. He passed away when I was 3. He passed away on Father's Day, and he got shot 7 times in his back by police officers. And he actually got shot in front of one of my older brothers. And he still talks about, like, it to this day. When I lost my dad, my family didn't even want to bring him up because they didn't want it to be like he died in vain. It separated. My granddad doesn't talk to us after my father passed away. He just, kind of moved on. Like, gun violence really separates a lot.
I'm so sorry.
It breaks a lot of foundation, but it hurts because it just hurts. It hurts really, really bad. And then people will never understand until they be put in that position. And I don't want nobody to be put in this position to where in gun violence. Yeah. No, like, it really divides the city. Like, it divides everything.
Yeah. I'm really sorry to hear that, Lakaya. If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha Ann Simons, and we are separating fact from fiction and discussing solutions when it comes to the narrative about Chicago and its gun violence problems. Our panel today is Lakaya Knight, who's a youth leader for Communities United, Kim Smith with the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, and Rita Oceguera, who is a reporter for The Trace. Rita, I want to discuss this issue holistically. Give us some of the root causes of gun violence.
Yeah. When I talk to people, they bring up the root causes all the time. That's what we should be targeting in order to reduce gun violence. So a lot of things that are brought up are housing. People need basic needs, really. Like, if you think about it, housing, healthcare, especially mental health care, jobs. Jobs is brought up all the time. People need jobs. If they don't have jobs, they're going to find other ways to make money, and that can lead to crime. Robberies can lead to gun violence. Like, it's all intricate, right? It's all put together, and it's all we have to think about it as a whole issue holistically, not just reducing it one issue at a time. It has to be done across the board. So those are some of the things. Yeah, very, very common things we often discuss on this program as well, and we'll talk more about it as this hour goes on. Lakaya, back to you. What are the kinds of resources you want to see?
I would want to see mental health resources, therapy, counseling. I would want to see recreational centers back in our communities. We literally have none of that, and I really feel like if that played a part into it, we won't have less gun violence. We'll have kids, teens, maybe even like adults go to these, get jobs. We need things in our communities that don't push us into the streets or make us be violent. And I don't want to just say, like, it's our fault, but it's not our fault because we lack these resources. So it's like, it kind of gives that narrative of kill or be killed. We have literally nothing to do, and I'm not saying that just converts us to violence, but it's just like when you push a dog in a corner. We literally have nothing. They keep depleting us. They keep draining us from things that feel like we're on restrictions. But by giving us accessible, even housing, affordable housing, if they give us therapist so we can talk about what happened, whatever happened, a loss of a family or a loss of a friend. If we have recreational centers, if they have stuff for kids where they can go to, where they can have outlets, where they can also get more resources, because we are one to another, we can help another.
Yeah.
That alone can help. I may not have all the answers, but I know it's people in power that do.
Kim, are there interventions or solutions that your data supports?
Yes, and actually a lot of them come out of Chicago. And I think that's something that is often left out of the national conversation about gun violence in Chicago is, yes, we have challenges, and we are also really at the forefront of identifying programs that work to keep people safe. And I want to acknowledge Lakaya both for her loss and also the work that she's doing to make sure that youth voice is incorporated into how we think about solutions, because a lot of the programs that we've had the privilege of partnering with in Chicago really have been found to be effective at reducing youth violence in particular. So programs that combine mentorship, relentless engagement, trauma-informed behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral interventions. Those are things that we know can be impactful and would not have this evidence base that the rest of the country is looking to has it not been for the work that happens in Chicago. So I think that's a place where we deserve a lot more credit than we get.
And Kim, there was a drop in shootings last year, right? This is according to your end of year analysis.
Yes, we saw a reduction in shootings and reduction in homicides. So far this year, we're also seeing reductions, not quite as much as what we're seeing in some other cities around the country, but we're moving in the right direction.
What's leading to the drop?
So it's hard to say. There's a lot of work happening, and this is kind of a national trend. So it's hard to see what in particular is happening in Chicago that might be different from other cities. But we know that things like community violence intervention can be really impactful. And I hope that you'll feature some of the folks doing that great work, I think later today. We also know that better management from the public sector can have a pretty immediate impact in shootings and homicides. So we're hopeful that some of that is what's factoring into the improvements we're making in safety.
Yeah. To that end, Rita, we know, solutions also need to be holistic. So, there's the prevention, there are the intervention efforts, there's also the aftermath. So tell us more about efforts that you know of that are going on and maybe the gaps that you still see.
Yeah, definitely. I love sharing about resources. It's one of my favorite things to do. Illinois has some amazing programs, in Chicago in particular as well, to try and help survivors of gun violence. We have the Illinois Crime Victims Compensation Program statewide that can offer up to $45,000, I believe, and depending on what you're applying for, funeral services, things like that, can be up to $10,000. So that's statewide. And then statewide as well, we have the Michael Moultrie Jr. Funeral and Burial Assistance Program, and that can offer up to $10,000 as well for funeral and burial services. And the Illinois Crime Victim Comp Program is reimbursement, so there's an issue with that, getting the money quickly. But the Michael Moultrie one is more upfront, within a month about. So depending on the documents that are turned in or whatever. But so those are some services that are offered. And then Chicago in particular has the Emergency Supplemental Victims Fund, and that provides money up front as well. And that's $3,500 for basic needs, funeral services, and relocation costs.
Yeah.
And that's across the city. In particular, 15 communities can apply for it. But if you have a youth that's 24 and under, they can apply for it citywide for any homicide, not just gun violence.
And we'll get you to share more of those resources later as well.
Definitely.
We have been talking about the nuances of causes and solutions to gun violence with Kim Smith, who's Director of Programs for the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, and Lakaya Knight, who's a youth leader for Communities United. That's a survivor-led racial justice organization. Thank you both so much for joining us.